Well, it looks like we're gathered up here. Good evening, y'all. It's good to be together. Perhaps let's start out on mute, unless you're a rabbi, a pastor, or a priest. Although there's other rabbis on here, so sorry. There might be other priests and pastors too. Who knows? There's a deacon. I know that. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Faith in the Ruins, our cheerfully titled discussion for tonight, based on the Walker Percy novel Love in the Ruins, one of my personal favorites. I'm really happy to have John Wilkinson from Chestnut Hill Presbyterian Church and Rabbi Adam Zeff from Germantown Jewish Center. I think it's the third time we've done something like this together. It's been a lot of fun. These are colleagues I really love. Our planning meetings are fun and rambunctious because we like talking to each other, and probably like to hear ourselves talk too. We had originally planned this session for something about building bridges across political divides. Perhaps we were too optimistic and wanting to rush forward. We had planned that kind of after the election and before January 6th. So in light of January 6th, we decided to, we talked, and together we felt that we should maybe adjust our conversation in light of a pretty disturbing event in our national history that left all of us feeling various ways, including upset, disturbed, angry, frustrated, worried, and maybe slow down a bit before we rush into conversations like reconciliation and talking across divides. One of the things I always value about these conversations, and that I think Rabbi Zeff said really well when we planned, is we're really looking at what our traditions bring to this conversation. You know, what does the transcendent element of our faith traditions bring to this moment in time that helps us out, that helps to guide us, help us cope and understand, helps us to find hope. We're not just going to merge our kind of religious understanding with the politics. We're going to keep those things apart in some ways, if that makes sense. Is that a fair summary, Adam and John? Yeah, great. I always feel a little intimidated with these guys because they're good. So with that said, so we'll have some introductory words for 5 to 10 minutes from Adam, and then John, and then back to me. And then we'll have a question and answer. There's enough people on here. It's like over 40. So that we will use the chat for the questions and answers, if that's okay. Quick instruction, if you don't know about the chat, at the bottom of your screen, there's kind of a word bubble with the word chat under it. Click that, and to the right of your screen, you'll get like a chat area. At the bottom, you can type in your questions. And when we get to Q&A, I'll field those and offer them up to the other two clergy here and myself for comment. So once again, thank you all for joining. It feels so good to be together. I love working this way across congregations, building up our life together. So Rabbi Zeff, would you like to lead us off tonight?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm also really grateful to be here and grateful for these wonderful colleagues and for all of you for coming and thinking about where we are. When, from Jewish tradition, there's just an overabundance of choices for looking for places where there's brokenness and even ruin. And there's just so many parts of Jewish history that occupy those kinds of spaces. But the paradigm really comes from the destruction of the temples. And so that's, there was the first temple, and then not so long later, a second temple, both destroyed by outside forces. that were stronger than the kingdoms that were that had created the temples and that were defending them. So you might expect that the result would be that Jews would say, well, those were really bad people. They came and destroyed us. Boy, that's terrible. Let's direct all our ire towards them. But the rabbinic tradition, in looking at the causes for the destruction, looked inside and not outside. Even that they knew. They knew the Babylonians, they were really strong. They had big elephants. The Romans, they had a strong army. But that's not where they looked to understand and find meaning in a place of brokenness or ruin. They looked inside. And famously, one of the main places they found a cause was in discord among the people themselves. That in the interior of the people, there was not only disagreement, but maybe uncivil disagreement, a lack of care, a lack of respect for other people, to the point, to an excessive degree, where people didn't respect elders, people didn't respect authority figures, people didn't respect each other. And to the point where when they describe the actual destruction, and we get those images in the Book of Lamentations, they really pick up on those images that are about horrors, people becoming less than human, mothers destroying their own babies. It's just awful, awful descriptions of inhumanity, and humans' inhumanity to each other. So that's something that we know about from a long time ago, right? That's not something new in our day, that we would cause destruction within our own community, within our own kingdom, within our own nation, simply by the way that we treat each other, not because of external enemies that weaken us. Of course, those are there, not because of forces like economics and things, which of course can weaken us and can cause problems between us, but really at base because of our inability to see each other as fully human, and to respect each other, to respect our differences. Those are the things that tear us down. So that's sort of the rabbinic perspective on how do you get to a place like that. And we're going to leave to maybe the end, or maybe the next time, this question of how do you rebuild from there. I think we're more in the question of how do you sit in this brokenness, how do you sit in the ruins. And I always like the story of Rabbi Akiva, a story I tell a lot, and I've unfortunately had occasion to tell a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. The story that the rabbis were walking around the ruins of the temple crying because they saw all that had been destroyed and they knew the causes of it. And so they were feeling despairing and hopeless. And so they're all crying, and Rabbi Akiva laughs. He's walking around laughing. And they say, why are you laughing? And he says, well, why are you crying? What's the problem? And they said, everything's been destroyed. Because of us, because of what we did to each other, everything has been destroyed. How could you laugh? And he said, oh, well, that's why I'm laughing, because, don't you know the prophecies, right? There's prophecies in the Bible that say there's prophecies of destruction, and then there's prophecies of renewal and rebuilding. So I'm laughing because I feel like, finally, the prophecy of destruction came to pass. So now we can look forward to the prophecies of rebuilding and renewal also coming to pass. Right? We had to have one in order to have the other. So if you believe in one, then you should believe in the other just as well. So that's, Rabbi Akiva laughing in the ruins is maybe too much for us. It's hard to laugh at a time like this. And of course, we don't ever want to say, I think we have learned enough at least in the last 4 or 5 years, to be able to say, we're never going to say, well, we finally reached bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. We know there's always more, people always have more depths in their inhumanity to other human beings. But things have happened that we thought were impossible, bad things. and so good things also that we currently think are impossible could happen. Right, we're seeing that with regard to the pandemic right now, things that we thought, could there ever be a vaccine? Now there are vaccines. good things can happen. And it's the question, I think, before you get to the question of how do we make good things happen, it's the question of how can we comfort ourselves? How can we regroup? How can we support each other in the midst of the ruin, just to be able to wait, just to be able to exist long enough to see maybe the seeds or the seedlings of new things growing.
All right. Well, great. You got us off to a great start, Rabbi Zeff. Thank you so much. Pastor Wilkinson, you want to pick it up from there?
Well, holy cow. It's great to see everybody. Now, one more Zoom trick. We're on 2 screens. So if you want to see who's on the second screen, there's a little arrow on the right side of your screen that you can see all your friends, many of whom are deciding not to share their videos with us tonight. They may be still eating dinner, but it really is a wonderful opportunity. And I think just to build on one of those aspects of this, and I don't remember the Spanish, but there's a placard in a church in Havana that says in Spanish what I'll say in English: there may be better times, but this is our time. So I think the question how we respond in our time, because this is the time we've been given, is really what's on the table. And it's so multidimensional, so complex. But the 2 resources I've been thinking a lot about is the Episcopal tradition and the Jewish tradition are much more honed in on assigned text for certain things. But we've been reading through Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, which is a letter to a church that's badly divided, that there are factions and people taking sides and people not treating people well, even within the church community. And that's just a reminder that the division and brokenness is not a new phenomenon. And I couple that with a book that's now probably 80 years old, 70 to 80 years old, with the unfortunate title Christ and Culture by Richard Niebuhr. But it's a reminder that there are different ways to think about this, but and if I were to rewrite that book now, I would want to ask the question: how does faith engage the world in which we're a part? And by faith, I mean kind of this weird cocktail of belief and behavior and practice and engagement. But now's not the time for persons of faith to take a step back, but really to engage the world in which we're part. And it's messy, and it's broken, and it's fallen, and it's complex. And yes, we need to sit in the ruins and at the same time envision what sitting somewhere else would look like, but doing all those things at the same time. And not to rush too quickly to some of our favorite words like hope and reconciliation, because those don't mean anything if you don't go through the process of getting to them. And I think especially about reconciliation, which is a word we take seriously, is, it's like saying I'm sorry and then going on and keep doing the same behavior. Well, there needs to be that kind of lamentation, confession, repentance, all those things before you can get to a new place. The other thing I want to add, and it's a thing we're talking about at our place a lot, is the role of the Christian tradition, the use of Christian tradition in acts that we would say are not acceptable, acts of violence, acts of anti-Semitism. And how can you talk about accountability without demonizing, villainizing, humiliating persons that we believe a creator God still loves? And how do you kind of live with that tension? So our group has heard me say I'm kind of struggling with that a lot right now, because I believe what I believe, and yet reality is calling some of that belief. It's not calling it into question, but it's putting it to the test. So I believe in reconciliation. I believe in hope, but I don't want that to be cheap hope or easy reconciliation. And how do we engage? How do we engage and not take a step back, not shrug our shoulders, not become cynical, and not saying that this doesn't matter. So that's a lot of what I'm wrestling with as we continue this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, John. That's terrific. If I can just follow up, you raised something really important, is that in the events of January 6th and the years before that, an aspect that we need, the Christian pastors on this call need to be really upfront about, is the Christian nationalist element of that. The white Christian nationalism that is fueling a lot of the violence and oppressive and dangerous activity. So speak of things to repent of, that's definitely one of them. And maybe later on, we should spend some time talking more about that, right? Because that's a super dangerous element in our country right now, and churches are dealing with it in a variety of ways, or not dealing with it at all, or promoting it. So for me, I've been focused in on the Psalms of Lament. This whole notion of when you're in the ruins, you sorrow. When you're in the when something you love has been destroyed, you feel it, and you make time to feel it. And that's probably part of why we decided to do this conversation and not the other conversation, because the conversation about building bridges maybe was rushing ahead, was rushing too soon past something that was really painful and devastating. So lament is this wonderful tradition that I was not raised with. So it's something I'm trying to learn later. But this notion of that when we suffer injury, including moral injury, when things that we believe in and cherish and love have been effaced and degraded and trampled on, our hearts hurt. We sorrow. We feel terrible, and we feel scared because we know we rely on these things, and our future is thrown into uncertainty. And I, for one, am trying to learn spiritually, like through my faith, to have and boy, has this last year been a teacher, has been an instructor in this, of how to sit in that space and be able to believe that that's part of faith and not a departure from faith. It's part of faith to stay in the pain, to endure, to persist, to be faithfully present to what's wrong. So many problems we have, I think, stem from pretending things are not horribly wrong, are not off the rails, or not horrors when they're horrors. And I was really struck by Psalm 74, which is another one of these Psalms of Lament that I believe is Israel reflecting on the destruction of the temple once again. Of course, I'll turn to Adam, as always, for... You should watch me every time I get nervous about my Hebrew. Go to Adam. So it goes, "O God, why have you utterly cast us off? Why is your wrath so hot against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation that you purchased long ago, the tribe you redeemed to be your inheritance, and Mount Zion where you dwell. Turn your steps toward the endless ruins. The enemy has laid waste everything in your sanctuary." And this next part, really, not to conflate too much the temple and the Capitol building, but this made me think of it. Your adversaries roared in your holy place. They set up their banners as tokens of victory. They were like men coming up with axes to a grove of trees. They broke down all your carved work with hatchets and hammers. They set fire to your holy place. They defiled the dwelling place of your name and razed it to the ground. Now, our Capitol building is not nearly as holy as the temple. However, some of that sense of the sacred being profaned, right? Something we hold in very high esteem, our way of government, our way of self-government, being so intensely trampled on is a violation, and we encounter the depth of our moral attachment to that reality when we see it crushed, when we see it harmed. So sitting in the sorrow, sitting in the lament for me is a way of actually reaffirming the moral value of the order of things. And if we treat things too lightly, we are essentially saying there is not a moral order here that matters, or nothing that I care enough about to be heard about, right? So I think this is a really profound exercise to know where we are feeling violated and what feelings go with that, like anger, sadness, grief, hurt, as a moral compass for us. And I think that's a key starting point, because the talk of reconciliation, to go into reconciliation with somebody who's harmed something that I hold of great value and esteem, I need to bring that hurt with me. That's part of the reconciliation. It's not reconciliation to go to that person and say, oh, it's okay. Good for you and your ideas, right? That's just not right. That's not a genuine effort to be authentic with each other in the reality. That's not to say that we bring scorn or contempt or humiliation into the factor which John talked about, which is part of what's driving us apart. But being present to each other takes a certain kind of relationship, both to what we believe and to the people we're responding to, if that makes sense. So I'll leave it at that. You guys want to respond to what I just said, or?
I do. You made me think about, the one brand of Jewish mysticism that, from a few hundred years back, taught that one of the essential things to realize about the world is that it is broken, and that it was broken from the beginning. And the world being whole is sort of a messianic dream. The dream is a world of wholeness. That's what we try to do. We try to repair the world, try to bring those shards back together. But the world is broken. And the reason you need a mysticism to teach us that, I think, is because the human tendency is to want to paper it over. And we don't want to believe in the brokenness of the world. It's hard to face. And so we turn our eyes away from that, and we try to concentrate on things, on trying to avert our eyes, trying to see the things that are whole, or just maybe if we squint a little bit, we don't see all the cracks. This teaching was designed to sort of break that open a little bit and say, okay, so when you encounter brokenness in the world, you're actually encountering its state, the state in which God, for some reason, created it. And you're encountering the work there is to do still in the world. And sometimes that work is overwhelming to face. It's, and we despair of ever being able to do that work. But that's always our work. And I think about, the ways in which over the past, say, 10 months, we've faced different kinds of revelations of brokenness, right? The brokenness of our country with regard to racial injustice, the brokenness of our country with regard to economic justice. And right now we're seeing it with regard to health justice, that our systems are broken, and we're suddenly seeing that only because people are saying, oh, wait a minute, that's funny. Over half the vaccines are going to white people in places like Philadelphia, where many fewer than half of the people are white. What is going on there? That's not that's not something that just came up today. That's part of the brokenness of our world that we usually turn our eyes away from and don't want to see. So I wouldn't say we always want to see it. We maybe can't live if we only see brokenness in front of us, but it's not like our normal state is everything is perfect and suddenly then we fall into this pit. We become more conscious of our brokenness at some points than at others.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. John, was there another response you wanted?
Just to add, I think the power of lament cannot be overstated right now, and we don't, in our lectionary cycle, don't spend a lot of time in the Psalms of Lament. And I think part of American Christianity's history is, you have a personal relationship with God that leads to salvation. And so therefore you're not going to focus on the brokenness that Adam just talked about. You're going to focus on the post-brokenness. And I think, and that's not a great feature of our history. That's just part of the history. So I think for us to linger in the notion of lament and lamentation for a season is not a bad thing. And for those of us who aren't as familiar with it, it's different than complaining or whining about things, but it is a kind of deep, honest acknowledgement of how things are and our role in that. And that doesn't mean we stay in the season of lamentation forever, but it does mean we need to dwell there for a while in order then to move to whatever may be next. So I just want to underscore that and how important it is, and what a rich resource the Psalter can be for this conversation.
Mm. Oh, yeah.
I wanted to just add that one of the things about lamentation, if you look at the book of Lamentations, is that it's contradictory. It has all kinds of feelings in there, including God has abandoned us.
Right.
God is punishing us unjustly for way beyond anything we possibly could have done. This is unfair. And all the way to, oh, we deserve this. Oh, this is all about our sins. How could we do this? Oh, this is actually all about the enemy. The enemy did this to us. So sort of the range of feelings that we might feel in confronting a really ruinous time and a very difficult time, it's there, right? That's there's not only one note when we're lamenting. There's a sort of a chromatic key of all these different feelings that we might want to express and sit with. And I agree with John, like being able to sit with those things. We have, of course, in Jewish tradition, we have a day of the year devoted to lament that is about the temple. It comes in the summer. And people have in recent years really been connecting it to things going on in our world, lamenting for the state of our world, not just lamenting for things that happened thousands of years ago. But one of the important things about that day is like you literally sit down traditionally on the ground and sit with it. And that's it's not something we're used to do, right? That's not the American way. The American way is if there's something bad, let's like devote 3 minutes to it and then go somewhere else. Switch the channel, go have a drink. But I think the way of a lot of our religious traditions is no, actually you sit with it. You sit with grief. You sit with anger. You sit with despair. You sit with those things and feel them. Because if you don't feel them, you're never going to actually be able to work through them, and you're never going to learn what they're coming here to teach.
And I think, just to add to that, I think that's spot on. And so two things I'm thinking. One, it's best done communally in a congregation, whatever that looks like, I think, so that you can share that experience. And kind of counter to the need to sit with it for a while, it's not to sit with it forever or exclusively. I mean, we've all done doom scrolling in the last however long, and we've learned that that's not always good for our soul to only do that. So how do you find a a point of balance in the lamentation where it's not only that, because if it's only that, then you'll become immobilized. But it has to include that. So there's a whole calibration thing going on in the moment that I find really important but challenging.
Thank you, John. I think all the talk of lamentation makes me, it's very liberating for me to read like the book of Lamentation and the Psalms and see and experience a very authentic, genuine, unrepressed relationship with God, right? I'm going to blame God if I want to blame God, right? I'm going to claim abandonment if that's the way I'm feeling. And Christians have a particular hang up on that, actually, which I'd like to just raise real quick. Where we're so locked into this notion that we should feel grateful to God that anything else seems like a threat to that basic posture of faith, right? So I've been teaching pastorally some people something, how to pray angry at God, right? You know, how to just, you know, if your heart is telling you God, and I use some foul language that I won't use here, but that's your prayer. Put that in God's direction, right? God can handle it, and you're not violating your relationship with God by, and it's not like you're fooling God by hiding your feelings from God, right? It's like, well, I'll put on a smiley face for God, and God won't notice anything else that's going on inside me, right? And that's a pretty nonsensical notion when you look at it, right? So the fact is, God knows us inside and out. God made our inmost parts. Good old Psalm 139, since we're loving the Psalms today. So, you know, we might as well be real, right? And see where that takes us. And real is lament, and real is anger, and real is abandonment. I also want to relate back to Rabbi Zeff's notion of revelation. Apocalypse, the Greek word, means to reveal. Now, this is a very ambiguous topic to bring up because the Christian nationalists love apocalypse, right? It's kind of their hobby. It's what they're hoping for. And they're looking to bring it on, in a sense, in the end of times, punish people we don't like sense, which is a misreading from my point of view, where apocalypse is God revealing how things are and the meaning of things, right? And we are living through that. Like Rabbi Zeff said, you know, we are looking at our healthcare system. We are looking at our economy. We are looking at each other. We are seeing the bare bones of our relationships laid out. We're seeing how bad we can be to each other. We're also seeing how good we can be to each other. But it's a very tense place to be. And resisting the temptation to simplify things to one thing or another is, I think, a major point, a major goal of sitting in lament, right? So I am in sorrow, I'm in pain, and I'm also in pain because I love. And I love because I hope, right? I'm going to hold those things in tension. I'm really feeling despair, and my despair is rooted in something I wanted better for my world, right? So we are capable as humans of holding things together. And I think that spiritual maturity, that spiritual liberty is crucial to us relating to each other as whole people, right? You know, not relating to each other because you're satisfying to me or you're pleasing to me or you agree with me, right? Something we could all learn, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking about what I believe it was wasn't it the Secretary General of the UN who said about the pandemic, science has succeeded, but solidarity has failed. And that's I feel like that's one of the senses of brokenness I'm feeling. We look out in the world and we see in large ways and small our solidarity failing. And even in the simple matter of, theoretically simple matter of people getting vaccinated, like how is our solidarity failing there? How are we, you know, we each of us want that vaccine, and yet how are we not managing to figure out how to be in solidarity with people who actually might be at more risk than us, who might actually need it before us and wait our turn. I was thinking though about just practically trying to come down to it, like what do we do? That there's two things, maybe opposite parts of Jewish prayer practice that might be helpful. One is, I think you were talking about this, Jared. Like, this was a teaching from a wonderful teacher, Rabbi Aviva Richman, who came and taught with us, and she taught about the audacity of prayer. And basically her teaching was that Jewish prayer was meant to be audacious. Like, we ask things of God that because we're seeing in the world, those things are not happening. And we should feel free to demand those things. Like, demanding those things is a way of reasserting moral authority in a world that sometimes seems like it's lacking it. Demanding those things is expressing our need for them to happen. And demanding those things is demanding them of God. Saying, if there's a divine power in the world, you should be helping us to do this stuff. So part of the point of our prayer practice is to have that moment of being able to, yes, demand things of God, ask things of God, particularly not on Shabbat, during a weekday prayer. That's traditionally when we do that. And to really to stand up for that. And on the other hand, that's one moment of prayer. On the other hand, most weekdays, we have a moment of prayer called Tachanun, which is traditionally was done by lying down on the ground, and it's prayer of supplication, and the supplication is partly about our own failings, what we might have done wrong, but also about the suffering that we are going through and expressing that suffering. And there's some psalms that we traditionally associate with it, Psalm 6, some of the other psalms that are really not even to the point of help me, God, but the point of I'm suffering here. I'm besieged. I'm just expressing that, says the psalmist. So, and that's a moment that in our prayer service takes about 5 minutes. Right? We have the moments of like pleading with God, and then we have this moment of like lying down or sitting down these days, and just letting that lament come out just for 5 minutes, and then we move on to something else. But I actually really appreciate having that moment. You know, I was thinking about this morning when we were doing it in our prayer service, having that moment. Very often I can't even get to the liturgy. Just having that moment of sitting down. Traditionally, the posture is you sit down and you put your hand on your head on your arm like this, and just to sit with the heaviness of despair, of hopelessness, of lament for the state of the world, and sit with that for 5 minutes, and then we stand up. And I feel like that's finding some way to express it or have an experience of it that's limited. Right, that's short, but that we can connect with. It's been helpful to me.
Wow, thanks. Can I give you a little bit of Psalm 6, the group a little bit of Psalm 6 here? I grow weary because of my groaning. Every night I drench my bed and flood my couch with tears. Yeah, I mean, the Psalms speak for me sometimes. They if I read the words, the feelings come, right? It's a weird effect, right? You think I know the feelings and go to the words, but the words make the feelings come that get locked in there. Yeah.
This is great. There are a couple really interesting questions in the chat room I want to get to, and we can talk about Christian nationalism a little bit. And actually, the questions are kind of related. But Bob Fless, are we perhaps equating the temple and the Capitol, that is, identifying our faith too closely with the American version of democracy? That's a great question. And because I read it, you two guys can answer it. How about that?
Wow, is that how this works?
No.
Well, I have something to say about that, though. That being, our profession is having something to say about everything. But yeah, I think this is actually there was a thread talking about this on a Facebook page that some very smart people trying to figure this out, just in terms of Judaism, that there is this danger since in synagogues, and rabbis will often talk about the state of the world and how do we apply Jewish teaching to the world, and this worry that it might actually collapse political views with Judaism and say, nope, they're co-equal. The Torah is telling you to vote for Joe Biden, or the Torah is telling you to vote for Trump, right? And that literally has happened, right, in some places, in the last few months, and how do we keep those things separate? So the way I think about it is that there is our federal government is one way of us fulfilling Jewish teachings to the extent that it actually does it, right? So things like we have an obligation to feed the hungry, and yet I, on my own, or even our community, or even if we bound together all the religious communities of Northwest Philadelphia, we don't have the resources to feed the hungry. But the federal government does, through the power of taxation, have the ability to use things like the SNAP program to make a meaningful difference in assuaging the hunger of something like 48 million people. So that's a great example of the federal government acting in ways that carry out the teachings of Torah. Of course, the government acts in all sorts of other ways that go against all the teachings of Torah and lots of other teachings of many, many religious traditions. So it is a hard thing. And I always remember Reverend Ernie Flores, who was such a wonderful neighbor for so many years. And he came to our sanctuary once, and somebody said to him, he said that people would say to him, "Oh, Reverend, you're just trying to support the Democratic Party." And he said, "I'm not trying to support the Democratic Party. I'm not trying to support the Republican Party. I'm trying to support Jesus's party. That's what I'm about." And I said, "Reverend, I think I need a different line." But I remember that line. That it is sometimes hard because to do big things, government does big things, and our faith traditions actually do require us to think big about how we can transform the world. But that doesn't mean that we need to collapse or should be collapsing. There should be distance. That's, I think, always the power of faith communities, is that we are not aligned with a party or with a government. We are not politicians, and we feel perfectly free to critique people from all kinds of different parties and political orientations. In particular, I always think, again, the hunger is a really great issue, because it's not like one party or another party has cut the SNAP program. It's been a bipartisan effort to try to take food out of the mouths of the hungry. It really is the independence of our religious traditions, I think, is one of the important things about them.
Yeah, I think I need to respond to this one, because I'm the one who ventured into this territory. I agree with Adam, of course, that they're not the same thing. And I think I prefaced what I said with that, that I'm not trying to conflate the temple and our Capitol building in Washington. On the other hand, what I think I was trying to point to is there's something analogous in the sense of violation of the sacred, right? Maybe there's probably big S sacred and small S sacred, right? There's the things that we cherish and value that might be secular, actually, or shared, or that we come at from different value traditions. But if you've been to the temple, boy, see, there, I just did it. Wow. If you've been to the Capitol, like I was when I was a little kid, it radiates a certain majesty. It radiates a certain awe and majesty, and I would say small S sacredness, right? And maybe I'm being too much of a Boy Scout, maybe I'm being too much of a true believer in our form of government, but those are hallowed halls for me, right? And I believe in what they stand for. So when that's violated, that reminds me of other violations. That reminds me of the great sacred violations. In our case, it wouldn't be the temple. In our case, it'd be the crucifixion, right? That'd be the great big violation in the center of our faith. And but that violation is sacred insofar as it has to do with human dignity, right? Human dignity is at the core of our confession. Is that we're creatures made by God. Even in our horrible brokenness and mistakenness, that dignity persists as God's gift, is restored by God's gift. And it's worth fighting for that dignity. It's worth ordering our common life according to that dignity. And when people show such flagrant disrespect for government for the people and by the people, that's, to me, a violation of everything I hold, So I'm not trying to say they're the same thing. and I'm not trying to say that our federal government should uphold one version of the sacred or another, because clearly it's not allowed to. It's not his job. But when I interact with it as a believer, I can't leave my sense of the sacred on the side. Everything I do is wrapped up in my sense of who God is. So I can't pretend like I'm religious one day and secular the next. Or I operate as a citizen from a holy secular place. That's a really interesting conversation to have, by the way. But there is this kind of funny American, I'm not sure quite what to call it, American pretense that we can like do our religion in the closet and then come out into public spaces and be some other version of citizen. And it's kind of compartmentalization, maybe. It doesn't work for me. Maybe it works for other people.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think again, I'm going to make up a word. The multi-dimensionality of this conversation is really profound. I think the nature of civil religion right now is an open question and a really fluid question. I mean, I kept thinking, as they were talking about the sacred nature of the Capitol building, I mean, our daughter lives in Washington. I love to go there, and we just love to walk around and look at the building. So there is that. But what was also violated was the people inside those buildings, and that's part of it. And what they represented, they were our elected officials. So that was part of it. I do think, again, the reason I brought up this old book is that there are models in history where we have collapsed religion and politics into one thing. There are also models where they have been so distant that they never talk to one another. And I think our model is somewhere in the middle where we're kind of, not regardless, but our traditions have kind of been the loyal opposition, that when the values are being upheld, like the dignity of the poor, that we can support that. When they're not, then we need to say something about that. And I think that's in part what this conversation is about, not conflating them. And I do think, to another question on the chat, Christian nationalism has conflated and collapsed the two in a particular way that others of us think is just not acceptable. And I'm not an expert in it. I'm always trying to be. I'm getting 10 articles a day on this topic coming into my inbox because it's so timely and so complex. So it may be worth another conversation. I want to be careful about it. But it's the belief of a certain slice of American Christianity that a certain form of political value is kind of foreordained, preordained, ordained as the only way, and we're moving toward that model. And some of that was at play on January 6th.
I wanted to hold up what Elisa wrote in the chat about writing that as a Jew, it doesn't feel like religion or faith or culture are things I can or am permitted to leave behind when I leave services. And that's certainly something we talk about a lot, that if what we do in our synagogue building doesn't affect what we do outside of it, then what are we doing there? The whole point is to be carrying those things with us. But I think that the events of January 6th also affected Jews in a very particular way. It wasn't a coincidence that that anti-Semitic slogans and sweaters and references to the Holocaust and were part of that protest. And the reaction, there was a certain kind of fear reaction, not only because these are important things in our democracy, but also these are the institutions that have permitted Jews to live freely and safely in the United States in a way that's relatively rare in human history. Right? Jews have a really good position in the United States that we haven't had in most other parts of the world, and frankly don't have in most other parts of the world. And so to see that system attacked, and by people who were, not all of them, but by certainly some people who were carrying these anti-Semitic slogans, made us feel like, are we safe here? again, that just immediately raises it for a tiny religious minority. Or the rights of minorities going to be safeguarded if we can't rely on those institutions to function properly? And again, it's not a. I read recently there was a study about, I think from Pew, about the religious breakdown of Congress. And Jews are overrepresented in Congress compared to our percentage of the population. But one of the reasons for that is Jews have invested a lot of energy in trying to engage the mechanisms of government to protect us so that we actually can live safely in this country. So there is a real danger, we read there, particularly as Jews, when we see those mechanisms being attacked. Or if those aren't effective, if law isn't effective, if politics isn't effective as a way of ensuring the rights of minorities, how can we feel like the rights of minorities, us and other minorities, are going to be safeguarded?
Yeah, wow. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, it was utterly appalling to see the cross next to Nazi flags. I mean, that's the juxtaposition that's so utterly horrifying and just appalling, and a strong reference to past Christian nationalism. I think the QAnon movement is essentially a resurgence of the slander. It's a resurgence of the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's that anti-Semitic Christian European attempt to blame the Jews for everything, and to make this kind of horrifying lie of that always seems to have the same components, right? Children are eaten. I don't even go into it, but it's horrible. It's horrible. It's there if you want to look it up. But here it is, something that I don't know. I was kind of raised hoping we'd put that behind us, but clearly I'm wrong, and that seems to be another characteristic, because whenever we think we've dealt with this, we haven't. And this Christian nationalist piece is terrifying for me. It's a complete affront to what I take Christianity to mean, because I think what's animating it is this notion that Christianity must dominate. Christianity cannot allow for plural belief. It cannot allow for other faiths to coexist and have voice and power and position in our polity. And because we must be, quote, a Christian nation, which means Christianity is the dominant force in politics that causes everybody else to conform with it, right? So there's one truth, and we've got it, you don't, and because we have it, we're in charge. Now that's not as it's not as fringe as you might think. Bill Barr falls into that crowd. There's a movement within Catholicism that is very much, there's a fancy name for it, and I'm not going to even try, but there's this movement that basically says in any country with a majority Catholic population, Catholicism should be the source of legal norms and government authority. And there's people who really believe that, like Steve Bannon, like Bill Barr. And it's bubbling up in our system, and it's right there, but you just have to notice it, right? And for the churches anyway, we have to do some hefty repenting and some very careful explaining about why our version of political engagement out of our faith is different than that. And for me, it's different than that because I'm not aiming for domination. I'm not aiming to tell my Jewish neighbor how to relate to their ultimate source of meaning, or my Muslim neighbor or my Hindu neighbor. I'm trying to find places where I overlap with those neighbors and say, let's work together towards these goods outlined by our faith, right? I call it the Venn diagram approach. These overlapping spaces where we can work together in a non-dominating way is my best version of pluralism. Because pluralism also has its limits, and this is all a pretty big experiment we're living in, and we just saw the fragility of it. That's one of the terrifying things is, okay, I believe in pluralism. I believe to a degree. I believe in liberalism to a degree, but darn, it's hard work. What the Christian nationalist is after is much easier. It's not as much hard work on the citizen side, because autocracy is kind of simple. Democracy is really hard. And one of the things I think we need to really look hard at is how all of us have not worked hard enough on our democracy. We can't just work on it. We can't just work on it in the crisis. We have to work on it between crises. Right. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
No, I was just, I appreciate what you've been saying. And but I wouldn't want to leave the impression that, extremism is not a characteristic of only Christianity. And certainly the loss of the, Judaism has a tradition of pluralism that involved in ancient times really validating the opinions of people with whom you didn't agree, and upholding and recording minority opinions because they were worthy of respect. And that tradition is imperiled more and more by people who, have lost that sense of true pluralism. And I'm talking about Jews, and really believe they have the one and only true way to express Judaism. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're on one side or that isn't only a feature of Orthodoxy. It could be a feature of liberal Judaism as well. So it is a very difficult thing to try to bring pluralism. I mean, pluralism, if there is such a thing as secular pluralism, that's hard. Pluralism within religious communities, that's hard. Pluralism between religious communities, maybe even harder. And so many people, I feel like, in that Venn diagram are trying to insist that there actually is no overlap, right? There's no overlap. There's only opposition. There's nothing that we share. And that's the dangerous part. If we don't share anything, then we must be opposed to each other. If we share something, then we can see that, oh, right, there's things we share, there's things we don't, then we're in relationship with each other. But if there's nothing that we share, then we're really in trouble. And it can happen in Jewish communities, Christian communities, Muslim communities, Hindu communities. Like this is something that religion is subject to, just like other institutions of society are subject to. And I feel like sometimes it's the we see religious running to the extremes because we see running to the extremes in every aspect of our lives, right? Religion is not insulated from that. God, I wish to God it was, but it's not. So it's really hard to maintain that sort of middle place where we can see the pluralism and still have our own beliefs, right? We can see the value in other people who disagree with us. That's a hard place to be. It's the place that I think Jewish tradition definitely has something to teach about that, but it's a hard thing to maintain even within Jewish communities.
Yeah.
Just a couple quick thoughts. Again, I think the question of extremism across religious traditions is spot on, and that's been a part of the chat, and it's worth unpacking another day what that looks like and what kind of social, cultural, political, economic factors come into play for extremism to kind of take root. I think the notion of pluralism, as Adam was just saying, I'll speak for our tradition. We know not a whole lot about other traditions. And I think part of that is some education and relationship building and things like that. So that pluralism just isn't kind of a slogan, but can be practiced at a much deeper level. I'm intrigued when Jarrett said we kind of compartmentalize. We do in a sense, but in another sense we don't need to, because the culture has been kind of mainline Protestant for much of the nation's history. So some of the things are presumed in kind of civic religion. So that's worth thinking about. The thing I keep thinking about recently is, what do we need right now? And I think the word I keep coming back to is kind of fortification. That may not be the right word, but the ability for us to say, yes, these are the values we hold to be important. We needn't be ashamed of them, apologetic for them. We needn't keep them to ourselves, or let other traditions try to blot them out. I think right now there is that sense that part of the ecosystem has ceded a lot of the conversation to other parts of the ecosystem. And I think one of the things we can do is kind of reclaim our place in the conversation, again, with humility, with integrity, with authenticity, and all those things. But we have a good set of values that need to kind of need a better workout in the conversation. And I think that can make a difference. And we need to say to ourselves, it's okay to say that and do that. That's part of it right now for me.
Oh, thanks, John. Well, let's open up the chat to some questions. Is that okay? We've been responding to some things in the chat. Are there other things in the chat we'd like to respond to? Any questions we want to? Oh, Gary Glazer says, the fact is that democracy has always been hard work. We saw from recent events how fragile it is. There was no guarantee that our national experiment would succeed, and there's no guarantee that it will continue. That's an observation. That's humble. That's a humbling and true observation, I would say.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I sometimes feel I want to be the champion of inconsistency. Because I feel like inconsistency is one of those forces that actually can knit us together a little bit, right? When you have people who don't line up in neat little boxes, right? Their religious affiliations and beliefs, their political opinions, their social connections actually don't match with what people think they somehow should match with. That creates some openings. And I've spent a lot of my life being accused of inconsistency. But I think it's a really wonderful feature. And I actually often say to kids who are going off to college, you're going to go off to college and people are going to tell you, you can't be this and that, right? You can't be, some people will say, you can't be Jewish and progressive. You can't love Israel and support freedom. You can't be religious and gay. So people will tell you these things, and those things are not true. And that's what you have to keep in mind. Like, people's ideas of what things go together don't necessarily have to be that way. And I think that pulls apart some of the divisions. And actually, when I think there's been some really wonderful reporting on people talking to people about their values and opinions, where you do see that kind of inconsistency. You see that people are not stereotypes. People do actually have conflicting sometimes opinions and conflicting things within their lives that make them think slightly differently about things. And I think that's something for us to actually cultivate within ourselves and in our communities.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think when you get to know an actual person, there's a lot going on there, and there's the unresolved. We're not as unified. We carry our own brokenness, right? We carry our own confusions when we're honest. And part of what's going on in the world around us is when we experience things as really nonsensical or really confusing, it's a good moment to say, well, what's really going on? Where's all this emotion coming from? To change the discussion from a discussion about ideas or concepts to a discussion about feelings. So, wow, this person's really reacting. This person's really in a muddle, and the ideas aren't making sense. But how could I be curious about that and ask, well, what's the feeling level under that? What do they feel like they're losing? What do they feel like they're afraid of? One writer is talking how about a lot of the kind of Trumpian movement, whatever you want to call it, is a reaction to perceived status demotion, right? For white people, basically. White people who think they've played by the rules and think they deserve what they have. And there's a lot of really interesting spiritual questions in that. Why is the deserving framework the primary framework of how you assess the value of life? Why do you place yourself in life through deserving? Right? I mean, at least in my tradition, that's not a primary frame. In fact, it's a spiritual danger. So I'm trying to think a lot about what does our spiritual frame have to offer this great, horrible conflict, right? What are the spiritual ailments that are being played out, right? What are the spiritual dis-ease that's underneath it all? And in our, early, right at the beginning, Adam talked about the rabbi laughing, Rabbi
Akiva.
And, the way I would translate that story into my story is, what we call the Paschal mystery is the death and resurrection, right? And what we learn through faith is that you pass through death to new life. And that's a very hopeful message, and a very helpful message during moments of status demotion, or moments where you have to learn to share control or domination or rule, right? Is you need to die to yourself, often a white male self, that thinks it deserves to be in charge. A white male Christian self, I should add, right? So what my greatest tragedy in this situation is the Christian nationalists are doing exactly the opposite of the Paschal mystery. They're refusing to die to self. Instead, they're over asserting self to the destruction of others, which bugs me, to say the least. Here's a question. Do you think the founders would recognize their democracy today if they could come back and see it? Religious leaders, what do you think?
I think they would be surprised by how religious the United States is. They're like,
yes. That's good answer. Right, all these our founding fathers who are all deists and chilly Anglicans and.
Well, and if I were in a small group, I'd ask Margaret to answer her own question first before we discussed it. But I do think, Ben Franklin got quoted a whole bunch in the last few weeks, right, about, the fragility of democracy. So I think in that sense, the ongoing experimental nature of this and the inherent brokenness of it, I think wouldn't be a surprise. I think other things may be, including the religiosity point. But I don't know. It's a great thought experiment to kind of try to draw those lines throughout the history to this moment. And I think we'd find some direct correlations and then some stuff that goes off way in a different direction.
I think most of them would be utterly shocked to find women in the Senate and the in the House. I think they'd be their wigs would fall off when they found African Americans up there too, and I think they'd be stunned. I think this whole game of guessing the founders is kind of a trap we're in at present. Like, it's this. Everybody wants to claim the founders to support their position. And I'm of the position where it's like, there's no way what they thought 200 years ago is going to hold up so well right now. Let's just take the Electoral College for an example, right? It's okay if they were wrong about a few things, right?
Yeah. I actually wanted to come back to, the idea of loss and how, this analysis that Trump supporters are reacting out of this perceived loss. I think that may well be true. I don't know. But I think there's perceived loss all around. And I think there's, for those of us who champion pluralism, and who champion equality and champion a change in the structural setup of this country that causes so much economic inequality and racism, we sometimes have this tendency to be like, right, and that's somehow going to be resolved without touching me. my entire life is going to be preserved exactly as it is, and somehow resources are going to be shared in a more equitable way, and other people are going to do that. I think it's one of the things we find within our own community at Germantown Jewish Center, that pluralism is great until it impacts what you want to do. And you suddenly have to actually give something up to someone else because they don't agree with you. And so we're working that out all the time, trying to figure it out. But that we're not accustomed to doing that in our society. And it's saying like, yeah, if I am succeeding too much, that means I'm going to have to succeed less if other people are going to succeed more. We can't simply just say, oh, right, well, we'll just grow the pie. Now, at a certain point, we actually have to be willing to say, some people are sometimes going to have to go in line before me. Speaking in the vaccine world again, if there's going to be more equity here. And I just feel like that's hard. That's hard. That's a hard sell to progressives. So how much more of a hard sell is that to people who are really not sure about that ideology in the first place? It's tough all around. And I don't want us to let any of us off the hook in the challenge of doing that.
And what's really funny about that for me, Adam, is a kind of a core concept in Christianity, and I think in Judaism too, is this notion of sacrifice. Right? I mean, sacrifice is part of our virtue system, right? Or part of what we say helps keep the universe running. And sacrifice is part of what keeps democracy running. You know, it's the grace of losing, the grace of compromising and letting something go that you care about is core to living in community. There's no community without sacrifice. And there's a lot of really interesting literature on this. And but it's a very uncomfortable term for us because I think Americans have kind of deluded ourselves that there is this existence without sacrifice. You know, maybe war, but you know, today that's somebody else's kids. That's not my kids. So we've even kind of compartmentalized the sacrifice. I think I've been really thinking a lot about sacrifice and how it's a crucial spiritual concept that we need to work a little harder on if we're going to live together.
Yeah, I mean, I talk all the time about because we live in America, a place that's founded on the idea of rights and a Bill of Rights, that Judaism is really not very interested in rights. It's really interested in obligations. So we have obligations to each other, and other people have obligations to us, and maybe the rights sort of are in the other people's obligations to us, but really we're thinking in terms of obligations. We can't actually make other people fulfill their obligations to us, but we can fulfill our obligations to other people, and that's what our lives are about. And maybe there's a balance to be struck there, but it feels like the American system tilts so far towards the idea of rights and things that I deserve that it skimps on the idea of obligation. And maybe, you know, I think we like to look back to the mid 20th century and say, oh, then people understood that. Didn't everything work better there because people understood obligation? But of course, they understood it in a very narrow sense of like obligation to people who were exactly like me, as opposed to obligation to the entire society where there was still so much inequality and oppression. But I think about those a lot, and when we talk about the Bill of Rights and we talk about the structure of America, I think, right, that's you know, America is not a Jewish state. It's not built on Jewish values necessarily, but it can be consistent with them sometimes. But it takes a lot of pushing, and it takes a lot of change in our spiritual lives to see ourselves as obligated. How do we see ourselves as obligated to each other? And that, you know, when we know that, you know, when we are face to face with people, we feel that obligation very keenly. But when we're in a country of 350 million people, how do I manage to feel obligated to someone who lives in Arkansas? It's rough. And we're seeing in some ways the limits or the stretching of that and even the questioning of the whole idea of obligation. And maybe people saying, well, maybe I don't have any obligation to that. Maybe this whole system where we, you know, tax people and then give some of their money to other people, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, because it's really, I don't have any obligation to those people. They should fend for themselves, and I can fend for myself. Right. So it's a deep spiritual problem, actually, for the country. Luckily, I only feel, you know, I'm really only responsible for 2% of it. So I have an easier job. You all have a much more difficult road to hoe there.
Our percentage is declining, Rabbi.
Yeah. I was thinking, I drive by, so this is maybe to the obligation point, which I love the framing of that. I drive by St. Martin's once or twice every day. And if you do that right now, you'll see a sign in the parking lot that says love your neighbor, and then about, I don't know, 100 iterations of what that looks like. And I don't read them all because I'm driving too fast. But that primary iteration about loving your neighbor is maybe a different way to frame the obligation question, and or at least to raise it up as a kind of stake in the ground for we who try to live by that principle, kind of evaluate what's going on right now. So how does any of this reflect love for neighbor? And I don't mean that in a simplistic way, because it can be complex and there can be different political answers to that question. But clearly, I think we know when we go way off the rails and what loving neighbor looks like. And in part, I've often said this. I often feel more comedy with persons in other traditions than I do sometimes with persons of my own. And I think that's natural. But how do we have that love your neighbor conversation within a particular community and then among communities? But it really is kind of just smacks you upside the head, whether it's what are my obligations to people down the street or on the other side of the country, or how do I love a neighbor, especially a neighbor who looks differently, maybe believes differently than I do, and how do you use that as the barometer for all this?
Yeah. I want to. Oh, go ahead, Adam.
I'm just sorry. I'm trying not to enter into the rabbinic debate about that line, but
okay.
That there's basically controversy about each of the three Hebrew words that make up that statement, right? The one that says love. So what does it mean to love another person here? Does it mean to feel nicely for them, or does it mean to give them what they need, do what they ask of you? Who is your neighbor? The Hebrew word is an odd word. It's not actually the normal word for neighbor. And does it mean somebody who literally lives next to you? Does it mean your friend? Does it mean somebody who's like you? Or does it mean something more expansive? And then the really, really most challenging part, like yourself, right? As if co-equal to yourself. That's really tough. How do I'm supposed to actually, I love my neighbor, but as much as I love myself, whoa, that kind of balancing is, so all parts of that are part, and I think you could draw those out. I luckily don't have to do that, but you could draw those out to encompass many of the political debates in our country right now, right? Are about what's the identity of each of those pieces.
Right.
I think I want to lift up something Victoria 6 wrote in the chat. Democracy is always battling against fear, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I wonder how much we could learn if we could better understand the fears that live in all of our hearts. And I want to lift up from that a wonderful book I read this year called Monarchy of Fear. It's by Martha Nussbaum. She's a wonderful philosopher. She grew up on the main line, actually, in a stultifying Episcopal environment, and became a Jew. She's very active at KAM Isaiah in Hyde Park, Chicago, where she sings in the choir. She's one of my favorite philosophers. She's fantastic. And she does this great thing where she takes the origin myth of Athens, which is all about the taming of the Furies. It's Athena strikes this bargain with the Furies, and the Furies are these represent all of our horrifying, impulsive, angry, hateful emotions, right? And she strikes this bargain with them that they can become part of the Athenian democracy if they behave themselves. So she tames the passions. Athena tames the passions and sublimates them into good order, right? For the good of the whole. and there's a lot wrong with Athens. I'm not idealizing Athens at all. But I love that metaphor because I think our furies are on display. I think our furies are right up in plain view right now. Our extreme passions, ignited by fear. So for Martha Nussbaum, the energizing root of these destructive passions is fear, and because fear engages us into being self-protective and egoistic and overly aggressive, whereas the kind of virtuous place to be is humble, benevolent, and future focused and constructive. It's a great book. I recommend it for everybody if you're plotting yourself through this time. Yeah, you're right. We should wrap up by 8:30, Adam. You're right. I see that there. Sorry, I had to bring up Martha Nussbaum. She's my philosophy crush at the present. Other questions for the chat? Any other questions for the conversation? Places you're at that we haven't responded to?
Just to say this, and I know we've said this before, I do think there is maybe during COVID, but certainly post-COVID, great potential for these three congregations to keep working at some of this at a local level. Maybe some of us read the Martha Nussbaum book together, for example, and have a conversation around it. But also maybe we take on some local conversations, because I think part of the democracy experiment, we've so focused on national and forgotten local. So just to lift that up, I think there's some interest and energy. Clearly, a bunch of us were on this call tonight about how we continue having a conversation, and how that conversation can get some traction around action would be really, all right, Margaret Spencer for the win.
Yeah.
I think there's some traction for us continuing to collaborate and see where this might take us, is my only point.
Yeah. I love this stuff that we do together, and I love anything we can do to be in relationship for the good of the community, right? And part of that is, Chestnut Hill has some Christian nationalism woven into it, right? It's part of our history, and we have some reflecting to do, and that means building bridges and opening doors and learning to be more open about just real history. I was having a great conversation with somebody from the Chestnut Hill Conservancy yesterday, and part of the trap the neighborhood's in is that we always feel like we need to be grateful to the founders, and that if we are critical, or if we want to get to the truth of things, or if we want to hold gratitude and tension with concern, that we are instantly ungrateful and out of the covenant. So it's a funny thing I'm learning about with the history of this area I now work in, is how do you create a community where you can talk about the things you need to talk about? That's a huge endeavor. And once again, it's part of this hard work of community and democracy that's, I'm a little worried that we're going to get through COVID and be like, it's going to be I've kind of wondered if we're going to go into the 1920s again. Because if you think about it, the Spanish flu was right before the 1920s, right? So there's this massive death event, grief and awfulness. And what the response was woohoo, so, and I can see myself doing that. I can see myself making martinis in a few years, but it's an issue, right? Are we going to come spinning out of this thing and go, life is short, let's have fun? Or are we going to come out of this with a kind of deeply chastened sense of how sacred life is and what we need to do to preserve it? Gary Glazer tells me not to make martinis in my bathtub. Thank you. Helpful advice.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do think that's going to be, God willing, we're going to have that challenge within the next year or two of figuring out how we come back. And when I like Elisa's idea, we can do both. But I think one of the interesting things about human beings, I was just saying this today, we're so adaptable. And here we are adapting to this time we could never have imagined. And yet the other thing about us is we love to get stuck in the things that we adapt to. we adapt to them and then we just do them. We're like, great, we'll do that forever. Even though the world changed, we still want to do it. So it's going to take a lot of strategizing, I think, and a lot of thought to figure out how do we go not back, but how do we go forward in a different kind of world is going to be an interesting thing. Not just about how do people go to their offices or not. Sure, businesses need to figure that out. But do we take our insight into all the brokenness that we've seen and that we're continuing to see and do something with that? Do something with that insight? Or do we, as I was saying at the beginning, or do we just like paper that back up, please? Let's just close that back up and go out to the movies.
No, that's great. Yeah, I like the both and approach. I think we should look at some public lament at the end of this. We'll probably have about 500,000 people, Americans, that is, dead. A huge number of people. And it's like one of those big numbers that's hard to process. And so we probably need some public lament, mourning, grief, space after this. And we also need to just really celebrate seeing each other again. So I'm up for both of those things. Well, is that a good place to be wrapping up, my friends? I am super grateful as always to John and to Adam for this time we've had together, and to all of you. Thank you all very much for being part of this. It's great to see everybody's faces, even if we're in little boxes. At one point we had 45 and then we went down to 28. I'm not sure what we said. But thank you for persisting and sticking with. Well, if you have an idea for a next topic, always send it along. Okay, good night, everybody. Have a great day. Love you all. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Be well. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, John.